Those are just good words to start the morning off with. You can have a seat, and I gotta just, I don't, this is a little bit short for me today. Usually it's something a little bit higher. Not sure who they thought was preaching this morning. But, hey, Nate, can you see if there's a better table back there somewhere for me? While they're doing that, and if we gotta stick with this, we'll stick with this. This is all good, but I got a little announcement to make for you guys. My wife and I are expecting. So we're really excited about this. This has been a long prayer. And then you guys learned a few months ago, about months or so ago, that Nate and Jillian, Pastor Nate and Jillian, his wife, are expecting also. So there's a lot of babies coming down the pipeline of this church. So be praying for them also. Yeah, so we are very excited. We're also, you just know that anytime you add that element to it, you're thinking, okay, now do we have to shift around? Okay, this is not going to work in our world in order for to get ready for this little baby. But we're excited, and it's a girl. My goodness, so it couldn't be any prettier than what it is. So, anyways, that's a good way to start off a morning. This is going to be really interesting for me this morning, especially as I got to deal with such a small little space. I used to spread out. My desk in my office is very large for a reason, because I spread out when I work, and I'm working up here, so this will be a fascinating time. Hey, couple of quick thoughts. Think back to when you were in high school, if you can't think back that far for some of you. Others of you, that was like yesterday. So you're thinking, that was just yesterday. This is easy for me to do. Man, high school is like littered with all kinds of social, peer, just even personal pressures. And you're like a fragile human being in high school, right? I mean, even though you put on this facade of strength, you're a fragile human being. So when I was a high school pastor, back eons ago, one student in our ministry, yes, that's, now it's like the, okay, let's spread out here, shall we? One of the students in our ministry walked into church one day. Now this student, let me give you a little background. This student came to Christ about 3 years prior to that. His mom passed away about 4 years prior to that. And so he was living with his dad, and his dad was still trying to figure out this new world of being a single dad to two teenage kids, actually, him and his sister. And so the home was a bit kind of chaotic at times. Now, his dad was doing his very best, but it was still, as a single parent, that's a hard world to navigate, especially when you come into it with somebody else at the time. And so this particular morning, this student comes in with a hat on his head, and which wasn't way uncommon for him, but he wears a hat this particular Sunday, and he sits down in the congregation, and the person in front of him, who was an older woman, turns around, taps him on, like kind of gets attention, and says, "You shouldn't wear hats in church." Simple statements, right? She in herself was thinking she'd being very instructive, but you could see the guy's countenance just drop. Because he woke up early that morning to come and help set up the high school room for us to have ministry in there. And that was a hassle in itself, just waking up as a teenage boy on time and getting there. And so he had to put a hat on because his hair was all over the place. It was bedhead to the nth degree, and so he put a hat on to kind of save face, we might say, and just look somewhat kept up so he can be there on time. And then he has this individual say, "You just don't wear hats in church." Now he, feeling kind of the pressure, the social pressure there that was going on, took his hat off. We could see just his countenance drop because there was some shame attached, right? My hair as a high school student in which now I'm noticing not only the opposite sex, but they're noticing me, and this is a bad situation. So there's some shame involved, there's some humiliation involved, he felt a little bit even judged in that moment. I remember I was sitting close by, and I remember seeing that, and I was watching the student, and I kind of felt to myself, where's the love, right? Now, she didn't know all of that, she had no idea of that backdrop. I was fully aware of it. And I remember thinking to myself, where's the love in this? I think that's a question that a lot of people are asking of the church. Where's the love? Right? Where's the love that is supposed to be given out to people? Because we're not feeling it. And that's why the series we're doing right now, I think, is so important, because we're spending 4 weeks talking about some of those hang-ups, some of those barriers that people have to Christ that perhaps we as a church put up. And this morning's talk really has to do with that. I think that student on that Sunday morning had a hard time hearing the message because he was so fixated on the experience that he just had. I think that's very true with a lot of people in the culture. Our message gets muddled because the experience they have in other areas of life in just common discourse of exchange. Whether it be in a social environment or a political environment, you name it, the message and the beauty of Christ gets diminished because of those other exchanges that we have, perhaps unbeknownst to us, but even still, there's this kind of thought of, where's the love in all of this? And so this message this morning, I think, is important because two of the biggest hang-ups that as you read stats, as you even talk to people, you learn that two of the biggest hang-ups that those in the world, we might say, those who are not followers of Christ have of those who are, is that they're judgmental and they're hypocritical. Now, we could debate all day whether that's a fair assessment. We can give all kinds of reasons why, hey, humanity is just that way, that's how we are. You can give all kinds of reasons or defenses or explanations to say why that's an unfair statement or not. But the reality is that that's really what the most common perception of a large section is. In fact, here's a little stat for you. I love stats sometimes. But the Barna Group, who's nationwide and does all kinds of research on people's perspectives and things, back in 1996 did a study to kind of get people's perspectives of Christianity. At that time, 85% of Americans has a favorable view of Christianity, and then a small percent had a very negative view of it. 10 years later, 2006, 2007, same survey that goes on, and now the tables have drastically changed to where 16% of Americans had a favorable view of Christianity. 38 had an unfavorable or a negative view, and the rest are kind of just neutral. That is sort of the same thing that I discovered as I went to Cal Lu this last Friday with Matt Maxey here and just talked to people. No one had a real positive view. It was all kind of neutral perspectives, and most of them were just students walking around, but there wasn't this favorable, Christians and Christianity, and this whole thing is just a beautiful thing, and I'm so glad that it's a part of our culture, just part of the world. Again, we can say those people are having wrong opinions, they don't really understand things, but let me tell you why those stats should really matter to us. Not because of the social influence that you may perceive we may be losing, because, guys, who cares about the social influence we're losing? What matters the most is their perceptions of Christ are being skewed. The ambassadors of Christ are being perceived in a negative light, whether it's warranted or not, it just is. And so Christ then is perceived in a negative light. That's why. And I don't want anybody to miss out on the strength and the beauty of Jesus' love for them. I don't want anybody, we should not want anybody to miss out on experiencing the love of Christ. In fact, I put it this way. You can write it down as a little caption for your notes. We don't want anyone to miss out on experiencing God's grace, but people are. But people are, because something is in the way of them seeing or experiencing. Now, there's a whole bunch of conversations that can attach to that. I want to focus our conversation today about our responsibility in that. Now, if you're joining us today and you're saying, I'm just kind of checking Christianity out. I don't even know, and here's an interesting, hey, I kind of felt that way at times, right? I want to talk to you guys, everybody in this room today, because I think this is something that whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, we can all learn about what it looks like to not be judgmental, to not be hypocritical. That's something that we could all have a conversation on. But I want to anchor our time here in Jesus' life and the scriptural text to say, this is what it's calling us to do. Now, here's what I'm not going to do, okay? This is not my goal for this morning. It's not to say that truth matters are trivial. It's not to say that you shouldn't have robust conversations about things that really matter, that you set aside things of practice and faith that really are paramount to our beliefs, right, of who God is. I'm not saying set those aside. What I am saying is we got to think about how we engage with people to communicate those thoughts, communicate those convictions, so they can see the beauty of who Jesus is and not miss out on that. That's what we're trying to do this morning. You hold on to your convictions, or even test them. But the convictions about who God is and what people need to know. But even still, there's a discourse, a dialogue. There's an approach that we have in our posture and attitude toward people. I was thinking long and hard about what really is sort of the reason, the fuel for this perception, but even, I'll say, for our being judgmental or coming across as judgmental. Now, here's the funny thing is, few people think they're judgmental, but others will tell them that they are, right? Few think they're hypocritical, but others will tell them they think they are. And here's why I think that people actually can be, unbeknownst to them. It's because of this word, stereotypes. We have a knack of stereotyping people. And I'm not just speaking to one kind of audience here. I'm speaking to everybody in all the world. This is a human condition. We stereotype. And a stereotype is a general predictive kind of statement about a person or a group of people. It's an oversimplification about somebody based upon maybe past experiences that you are transposing onto them or various other reasons. But it's simplifying them down to being kind of predictable and domesticated, and so you know then how to respond. And it's what we do so that we know how to navigate our world. But the problem is the stereotypes then cause you to relate to people in just one way. Now, you could try to be gracious, but as long as that you have that overarching stereotype or generalization about them, then you will engage them in that way. That's just the reality of who we are. And we've all got them. We've all got stereotypes. We all experience, we all live in this world, and the hard part is for us to see beyond those stereotypes. And this is the challenge where we allow the scriptures to kind of speak to our heart, and it takes great humility to hear what other people are saying, going, okay, I didn't think I was that way, but you're saying this. Maybe I need to reevaluate what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. Stereotypes are a huge, huge reason, I believe, that this is going on. I look back to that scenario in which I told you about that student and that older woman. And some of you might be thinking to yourself in that scenario, man, what a crusty old woman, right? How could you misrepresent Christ so drastically and become so hung up on such a petty thing? You just stereotyped her. You don't know much. Yeah? You're just evaluating who she is. That woman has history, that woman has experiences, that woman has other voices speaking to her that informed even that situation, unbeknownst. And so we immediately draw up sort of conclusions about people, about the way they are with little information, and make that all about them. So the point of that first story wasn't to say shame on her, it's to show us that we all have this propensity to label and to act in a way that we don't take consideration the other person that we're talking to. That's what stereotypes do. So, here's what I want to do for this morning. I want to give us two principles that I see need to be lived out and taught, or that I see that are lived out and taught by Jesus and the writers of all the scriptures that are essential for conveying the kind of love that we are saying we want to convey. Two principles that I see in Jesus' life and his teaching and all throughout the scriptures that are essential for us conveying the kind of love that God's called us to convey. That's what we want to do this morning, or experiencing God's grace, as we pointed to earlier. The first one, just to jump in, number one, is this. We got to treat people not as stereotypes, but as complex creatures. Complex creatures. Dr. Tim Muehlhoff over at Biola, who's in the communications department, he calls this, or he says, in the field of communication, this is called cognitive complexity. How complex is your world for people to be in? Is it just Democrats and Republicans? Is it just Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter? Is it just us and them? I wrote a few other down. Is it just liberal and conservative? Is there no complexity to individuals beyond those labels? But see, we sort of operate in a lot of those circles at times. How complex is your world? Do we have such rigid categories that they, or people, so we know what they're thinking because they fit into this category? That's kind of how it works. I see this complexity taught all throughout Scripture. Proverbs 14, verse 13 says this. It says, even in laughter, the heart may ache. Even when somebody is laughing deeply and showing off one kind of perspective, one kind of stance, the inside part of the person can be a drastic shift, a drastic change. It means that there's a lot going on beneath the surface of what you and I know. They could be the most arduous, passionate, angry, out there person, right? But inside they are just wounded and they're hurting and there's a lot going on that you just don't know. Speaking into the condition of their hearts. One communication scholar said, if you don't know what hurts me, you can't love me. I think there's a lot of truth to that. If you don't know what hurts me, then you can't love me. Part of the reason I see that in my 3-year-old boy, because he's a little bit oblivious to what actually hurts people, and so he actually goes about hurting people, not expressing much love. It's a lack of information. It's lots of self-awareness, a lack even of care for the other person. If you don't know what hurts me, you can't really love me. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5, the purposes of a man's heart are deep waters. Deep waters. They're way down deep. To get down there, you got to get some skills. They're beneath the surface. The reasonings that people do things, sometimes they don't even know the full reasonings they're doing them. Have you noticed that? We do things and then we discover why we're doing them. Have you ever said to yourself, gosh, I never knew that was me. I never realized that about myself. Yet I've been operating like that for the longest time. And now I'm just starting to realize that who I am, what's driving that. You just discovered deep waters. You just discovered deep waters. People are acting out and living lives from a deep well, oftentimes very unknown well of life, of experience, of emotion. And it goes on to say, but the man of understanding draws them out. It's that person who asks a question with skill or who takes the time to listen. And because of that exchange or interaction, you go, man, that person helped me to see what's going on inside of me. This is exactly what Jesus did. This is exactly what Jesus did. I mean, Jesus in John chapter 4, he encounters a woman from Samaria. If you don't know the story, this quick snapshot of it, Jesus is with his disciples, and they've been traveling, and they're thirsty. The disciples go off into town to buy food, and Jesus starts talking to a woman from Samaria. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that socially. One, because she's a woman. Two, because she's from Samaria. And three, because we learn in the discourse that she is divorced many times. Now, Jesus could have treated her stereotypically in so many ways. As most were in that day. As a woman, we don't associate with women. We don't talk in these contexts, right? Women were not considered as well-informed or as well able to kind of handle the things of life, so they had to be, so Jesus could have addressed her that way. As a Samaritan, someone who was kind of defiled by birth, has wrong theology, lives on the other side of the tracks, but he didn't. Could have treated her as a divorcee, worked on her 6th marriage. It's a lot of times. But he didn't address her in any of those ways, and they went deep together. Meaningful conversation, deep together. In fact, she was so invigorated by that conversation, she went back to her village and told everybody, you've got to meet this guy. You've got to meet him. He told me everything about me, right? But guess what she didn't feel? Judged by it all. She felt understood. She felt valued. She felt listened to. Zacchaeus, Luke chapter 19. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, right? You know the song, if you sing that in Sunday school at times. He was a wee little man, was he? But he was a tax collector, this guy. Tax collectors weren't very popular. Tax collectors kind of sold their soul to the devil in that day, we might call the Roman government, because they ditched their people for money. And they would cheat their own people to line their own pockets and pay the taxes to Rome. Jesus encounters Zacchaeus, and he could have treated him stereotypically, like a tax collector, like everybody else did, but he didn't. He treated him like a human being, and he even invited himself to his house, which is pretty crazy, had a meal with him, and they went deep together. Great conversation. They went deep together. In fact, here's one more. Turn to Mark chapter 2, because this one is also an experience with a tax collector. But I want you to see how Jesus engaged, because on the Zacchaeus, you kind of see that he went to a house. Here's actual exchange of what may have happened at Zacchaeus' house, but has happened at somebody else's environment. Mark chapter 2. This is when Jesus calls one of his disciples. His name in the text here is Levi, but Levi eventually becomes Matthew, who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. But after Jesus called Matthew, said, hey, follow me, verse 15 says, apparently there's some information between that he went to Matthew's or Levi's house. So as he reclined at the table in his house, that is Levi's or Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many who followed him. That's not saying that many were believing and had salvation. That was saying that many were like, who is this guy? I want to get to know him more. There's something appealing or attractive about him. I feel at least a comfort level. I can follow him and be around him without the judgment. In fact, this brings it out. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now, they would have been fully okay with Jesus preaching to them from a distance. But they weren't asking why he preaches to them. They asked why he eats with them. Because in eating, you sit down at a table. You give value and worth to somebody as you sit in the circle and you're all there together. You're listening to them. He is in this situation giving voice to sinners. He's giving them a voice. Letting them dialogue. He's not preaching the Sermon on the Mount. He's not preaching. He's listening and he's dialoguing, giving them a voice. And you know what the greatest example of love, we might say, is when you listen to somebody? Because at that point, you aren't sitting there saying, I have the information and I will dispense it to you. And it's not just listening in order to assess like a doctor and then give the information. It's just listening to them and letting them speak. Letting them share. When somebody shares and you listen, you give value to them. You say, whether I agree or disagree with you, the fact that I'm going to listen to you says that you're worth my time to sit with and to care about. Why is he eating? Why is he giving the time of day? Why is he in that environment? You shouldn't give voice to such people. And Jesus says to them, verse 17, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Now what's fascinating about that, what's fascinating there is Jesus attaches his preaching world about calling sinners to this almost non-preaching scenario. I'm sure Jesus gave thoughts. I'm sure he dialogued. I'm sure he says, godly words, because how could he not say what is true? But he attached calling sinners to this experience of just sitting there and engaging in life together with people who were, their opinion are ones you don't want influencing politics, right? Because they're going to go the wrong direction. They're the ones who are steering our culture the wrong direction. And he sat down and he ate with them. That's how Jesus went after. That's how Jesus sought and saved. That's how Jesus operated as a great physician for people. Oftentimes it did entail him preaching, but we see time after time after time of Jesus sitting with people who otherwise were considered sinners and outcasts. And their lifestyle wasn't an unjust assessment at times of them, but he realized, hey, even in laughter, the heart aches, that the heart of a man is deep waters, and a man of understanding draws them out. But how do you understand unless you listen? I'm going to go and model for my disciples what it looks like to make disciples, where it starts. I have a friend that, actually I'd say she's more of a past parishioner, is a good way to put it, but she was a good friend for a period of time while I was over at Everfree Fullerton Church, except in the young adults group there. And I want to read to you her story. She wrote this down for me because she engages in an area and talks about an area that I think a lot of our stereotypes are built up around. And I just want you to hear the complexity of her life on this. She said, I got pregnant at 17. My parents had divorced 3 years before, and my dad was living 500 miles away. So he was out of the picture. My mom's family was all about appearances and didn't speak of problems, much less handle them. So I knew I wouldn't find guidance and support there. Even though I graduated high school as an honor student and had my life ahead of me, I was hopeless. I was abusing drugs and alcohol since they were allowed in my home. So my boyfriend and I discussed our situation, decided we weren't equipped to raise a child, and since I didn't want to be embarrassed about giving a drug baby up for adoption, we decided on abortion. Even though I was thankful to get away with it, the entire experience was traumatic. I was overwhelmed with embarrassment and shame, but determined. I struggled through it, was anxious for it all to be over and for life to just go on. Growing up in church and living in our society, I knew there existed pro-lifers that picketed abortion clinics. Never did I think they would be picketing me. As I drove away from the clinic, my boyfriend told me to put my head down so I wouldn't see the grotesque pictures. I still heard the yelling and the cruel names they called me, even with the window rolled up. Like I didn't hate myself enough, she says. I knew. They didn't have to tell me. I was so fragile, and this was how people focused their energy. It was demeaning and unkind. Physical healing takes some time, but I eventually healed. Emotional healing is what takes time. But I had no idea that was even an issue. About a year passed, and I found myself wondering how my life would be different if I had chosen a different path. I used more drugs to stay numb. The pain of my loss was too great, and I had no idea how to handle it, but to stuff the feelings down. I ignored them. I couldn't exactly talk to anyone about it either. I was depressed. My boyfriend was abusive in every way you can mean the word. I was suicidal. I held razors to my wrists and a gun to my head. Then I got pregnant again, and I had another abortion. I was so lost. My dad started communicating with me frequently. It was an answer to an unknown prayer. From 500 miles away, he encouraged me to move out on my own, and I did. 2 months later, I gave my life to Jesus and was baptized. I felt the guilt and shame lifted. I love God for his guidance and love and support, and yet, even with the saving grace of Christ, I was still hurting. Old schoolmates and friends that knew my story didn't know how to help. My best friend, someone I had prayed with, laughed with, cried with, ministered with, and shared holidays with, couldn't stay by my side as I dealt with this. I realized I couldn't be real with her. Sadly, that 3-year friendship dissolved. Growing up, I had never experienced a death, so I had no idea how to grieve a loss, and this is definitely an issue of loss, especially for a woman who has always dreamed of being a mom, particularly a good mom. With the help of a trusted counselor, I came up with an idea on how to honor the 2 lives and lay them to rest. I purchased an empty grave space and a marker with the names I gave my 2 children and their dates inscribed. Each child has one. It took me a year to pay for it, and I carried the bronze marker in my bag for 2 months so I would feel the weight of it, so I could also feel it relieved. I called 10 people I trusted to have a funeral service with me. Friends, family, coworkers, and the pastor of my church, which was me, met with me and supported me as I bawled my eyes out and grieved the loss of the first little life, Sarah Rose Scott. Songs were played, truth was spoken, and I went home. It was so healing. It had been exactly 10 years. I finally felt it was at rest. 3 months later, I had a second funeral to grieve for and honor the second life, Paul William Scott. It's not just the pain and grief of unresolved loss, it's the inability to feel joy at the news of someone else's pregnancy, even when you truly want to be happy. For me, it was being stagnant for 10 years and not knowing how to move forward. It's the sadness as I counted the years and imagined having children in school. It's the feeling that I can't talk about it for fear of judgment. Even though we all say we understand God's forgiveness, humans are so weird. It is much more socially acceptable to be a recovered drug addict or a gang member in the church. It's the evil feeling of condemnation when walking in a church or a Christian paraphernalia store and seeing bumper stickers with brilliant slogans such as "abortion is murder" and "abortion stops a beating heart." Like we don't know that. I can hear the angry mob all over again. Wouldn't Jesus be at the back with outstretched arms? Just saying. It's wondering if family that knows will throw it in my face at any time. It's praying that one day I will marry a good man and even be able to conceive, that I don't have to have irreparable damage done to my body. These are some of the consequences of abortion we don't necessarily think about. These are the things I didn't have a clue to consider when I was at the crossroads. I had an urgent decision to make and had no one to support or guide me through it. I thought it was an easy fix, yet I will live the rest of my life with the consequences of my choice. Guys, I am not reading this in order to give you a template for how to grieve, nor to say that this is the experience and the feelings, the emotional process of everyone who has an abortion or the abortion industry. That's not what I'm saying it for. But it's to remind us of the complex voices and experiences and emotions and relationships that inform all that we do. There's a complexity going on. It wasn't just the surface level there. There's a lot going on here. The late American writer and poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. Let me read that again. If we could read the secret history of our enemies, those who we have the greatest stereotypes for, we should find even in them, in each man's life, sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. So here's the word that categorizes what we're being called to develop here. It's compassion. It's compassion. This is where all of this is pointing. This is something that Jesus was described as in so many passages in the Gospels. That is what fueled him actually to respond to people. That was the inner working of his bowels, his angst of seeing people not as what he saw on the surface, but knowing the complexity of people and all the deep waters beneath them, to stay and sit and be and engage and to sit at the table with and to love on. It's compassion. But stereotypes suffocate compassion. Stereotypes suffocate compassion. It removes you. Let me just use a little example on this, just for our conversation here. There's been a lot of conversation in the news, in the media, about this whole, if you heard a few years back, but Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, all this rhetoric going on, right? And I'm guessing you've made some decisions about what camp you align with. Let me guess that most of us in this room have decided that without really doing a lot of talking with people who perhaps experienced the other side of the coin. And just listening. Trying to understand what really are the dynamics at play there. What are the deep wounds going on that is informing their activity and response? Whatever side that you're on, have we really engaged, or have we just allowed the social media and the media of the day, our favorite news channel, to be the voice that guides and directs our thoughts, to reinforce the already conclusions that we have made? Based upon our past history and our present circumstance and the future and the political stance we have we allowed ourselves to even engage? Say, if we're on, let's say, one side, to engage and say, what is it that's going on in your experience? I just want to understand what's going on. Suspend judgment and listen to the person and the heartbeat of them. I don't know if that's in our practice. And I'll tell you why it's not so much, because it takes time and we don't have the time, right? It's easier to kind of create a stereotype. All those people are just thugs or are criminals, or all those people are just racist people, and those are stereotypes. Those have no place in the community of God. Those thoughts have no place in the community of God. We are called to be people who don't operate as Americans. We operate as Christians. We don't operate as a political view, as a Republican or a Democrat. We operate as kingdom citizens. That is what some of us need to be less American. We need to be less political party that you are. You need to say, step back and say, I love my flag, but I got to step back from that and really say, Jesus, what is your heart? Because I need to communicate you, not America, you first. Primarily you first. They're the one they need to meet. It's you. This whole political landscape is ramping up We put little sound bites out and we propagate videos of people saying certain things. And guys, videos are doctored. Yes, there's some truth in them, but they're doctored. Have you done the research to do, or are you just propagating your favorite voice out there? I'm just saying, are you moving forward a stereotype, or are you really promoting, hey, we got to be people who have compassion and who listen in this chaotic landscape? And that might mean that we lose or feel loss, experience things being taken away. But this is where we have to realize that nothing gets taken away from us. All good things come from where? So what's really driving this? Standing in the way of compassion and fueling our stereotypes is fear. Isn't it? Fear of how that might impact your future comfort. Fear of how that might impact the experience you have in the world. Fear of the possibility of their badness impacting your world. Fear. It's so funny that Jesus in the scripture speaks so often about fear. Maybe it's because that is an area that we do so poorly on. And we have other words for fear. We have other ways of masking. Oh, it's not that I'm afraid, it's just that I'm concerned. Right? And then we put on it's not about me, it's about my kids. Guys, the same God who's got you has got them. They do. Fear. Here's, 1 John. Is that the next slide? Yeah. John writes about the connection of our response to people and this area of fear. By knowing and believing the love God has for us, that's what he said before that, is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is, so also we are in this world. As he is, as we reflect upon his love, reflect upon his goodness, really let that seep down, is that love perfected, because as he is toward us, we will then be in the world. And he goes on to say, there is no fear in love. No fear, zero. Because love, or perfect love, casts out all fear. Perfect love casts out fear. Now, where's that perfect love coming from? Well, it's not from you. It's not your parents. It's not society. It's Christ, right? God has shown his love for you. And that casts out fear. Not just the fear of future in this passage talks about a little bit about judgment in the future. I'm not just only not afraid of judgment, but Jesus at times would say, in this world you have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. Do not fear him who can take just the body, but fear him who can take the body and the soul and cast it into hell. That's who you fear. And God has diminished that fear away entirely. So now you can approach the world with confidence and joy and even rest in the midst of a chaotic storm. For fear has to do with punishment. And whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love others because he first loved us. Can I tell you what this means then? Number 2 in your notes. Number 2, write this down. You need to own your fears as primarily your issue. Don't pass off, say, that person, that's my fear because of what they're doing. No, this is your issue. I think of a time, powerful statement Jesus made to his disciples, a question he asked that has penetrated my heart this week. But he's in the middle of the lake, and there's a massive storm raging all over. The disciples are terrified because Jesus is in the boat sleeping. I don't know how he pulled that one off. I get awake when my boy starts crying, and here he is in a storm, and he's sleeping, and the storm is causing the water to overflow in the boat, making the disciples afraid they're going to drown. So they wake him up. Jesus, do you not care about us? The danger and the peril that we're in. Do you not care about those things? And you know what Jesus says to them? He says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Because this is your issue, guys. I know you can't control the storm. I know you can't control the waves and the wind and the water. Right? You think I'm being absent here and it's all going to hell in a handbasket and you're going to die in misery. Do you have no faith? Why are you so afraid? Disciples, it's not the issue of the wind. It's your issue of trust. That's what he's saying. We need to realize that our fears are primarily our issue to deal with. That kind of changes the conversation a little bit. Changes the conversation for us. Because fear fuels stereotypes, suffocates compassion, and that causes judgmentalism and results in your hypocrisy. Because Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verse 1, that you therefore should not judge people. And he's just talking about all the problems people have, right? Because you yourselves do the same thing. Your stereotypes, fueled by your fears, are causing you to not see just how sinful you are as well, and the place and stance you have before him. I want you to imagine with me as I close here. I want you to imagine with me being blind. Now, I've never been blind before, but I've been in dark rooms, right? But you're blind. You got your walking stick, and it's got a little red thing on the bottom, and you use that to get yourself around. And one day you make a foolish mistake, and you fall into a big pit. And as it turns out, there's a lot of people in the pit already because everybody's blind. And that pit swallowed up a lot of people. You've been in there for a long time, and you are just wondering, how in the world do I get out? You're screaming for help, and as everybody else, help us, but nobody can help you because they're all blind, right? Finally, one day, an individual comes over there who could see and reaches down and says, give me your hand, and he pulls you up out of the pit, and then he restores your eyesight so you won't fall back into the same pit. So now you see, and you're relieved from that pit, but then you look down and see all the people who are inside there. What do? I think what a lot of us are doing is taking that stick that we used to walk around with and now beating them in there. Why are you so blind? Why are you in that pit? Your voice is impacting the world. You guys are be silenced and controlled and contained and quarantined. And we beat. Now that we say that we see because Jesus made us see and that we are out of it because he brought us out of the pit, we are turning around to other people who are living in blindness and living in separation from God and beating them over the head for not seeing it. And they're living out their sinfulness and we're beating them up as opposed to taking some time to listen, care, just like Jesus sat down just to maybe soften the soil a little bit so the seeds of the gospel make sense to them and those barriers to seeing Christ are removed. Our fears fuel stereotypes. They suffocate compassion, which then has us every time communicate in a judgmental way and ends up being hypocritical. Guys, we have to just really assess our fears. Treat people not as stereotypes in any way, and really, that'll take some work. But as complex creatures made in the image of God who need to understand the love of God. And that's going to take, at times for us, it's going to require a sacrifice from us. But all good things for us come from above, and we're waiting for him to bring us into glory. Even in the circumstances of life, he is the one who provides our food. He is the one who provides our shelter. He is the one who provides our relationships. The world doesn't give us those things. His good hand does. Do we believe that or do we not? That's the question for our hearts. We're going to go into taking a meal that Jesus used, actually, that this table became very symbolic of the unity that you have. Hey, we're all sinners saved by grace, those who sit at this table. And so there's no rich and there's no poor. There's no Republican, there's no Democrat. There's no superior person over another. There's no Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or White Lives. Everyone at this table is on equal ground, and all biases go out the door because Jesus is all in all. He is all in all. This meal, the body and blood of Christ, is something that we celebrate. And hopefully, I pray that we actually can live out in our day-to-day activities as we go about this world. They're going to pass out the stuff, and then we'll take it all together. So let's do that now.